Chitan Kadilu. His paper is Confession of Despair in Creative Process. Please start.
I pay my respects and pranam to Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa and Swami Vivekananda. Respected Swamijis and my dear friends. Yesterday evening we had a wonderful inaugural session, and I guarantee that I will finish it within the time. I'm quite conscious of it. And Swami Bhajanananda Maharaj took us to some high peaks of creativity. He traveled through music, painting, theatre, everything. I was really wondering, how he got such exposure to even the contemporary. Most of the people dismiss our generation's art, saying it into but he gave due consideration to that. And then yesterday when he was talking, I was thinking he was talking about Rupa Brahma, and I belong to the group. We take Varna Brahma, because world is not created, universe is not created in black and white. So this is another kind of worship through colors I am doing. Now I am coming to the main paper. The French Impressionists blamed photography. There was a reason for it. All along they were depicting a particular light and mood to give the feeling of what it was to be somewhere specific at a given moment in time. What can be photographed need not be painted. Photography changed many things. Some artists chose to substitute brush by the camera. Photography was cheaper and could be reproduced. Even Delacroix tried painting was dead. For the Impressionists, it was an argument to gain an edge over others. For the first time in history, a group of artists liberated color from object associations. If we look back, that was a glorious moment which gave birth to all that we now call modern. We are discussing this now after 87 years of the most celebrated Impressionist master, Claude Monet's death. Monet died in 1926. The paradox remains that in the last decade, photography and digital art have entered through the back door. Artists had an argument to support that also. When camera and computer can do a thing so fast, why waste your precious time on such finish with hand-held brush and toxic colors? Since this particular occasion demands, let me start with an incident in Sri Ramakrishna's life as recorded by his biographer Romain Rolland. Most of you must have heard that. It starts, nobody imagined what infinite spaces, what tremendous depths lay hidden in the little body of this laughing child. They were revealed to him when he was 6 years old. One day in June or July 1842, he was sauntering along with a meal of little puffed rice carried in a fold of his garment. I quote Sri Ramakrishna's words. I was following a narrow path between the rice fields. I raised my eyes to the sky and I munched the rice. I saw a great black cloud spreading rapidly until it covered the heavens. Suddenly, at the edges of the cloud, a flight of snow-white cranes passed over my head. The contrast was so beautiful that my spirit wandered far away. I lost consciousness and fell to the ground. An excess of joy and emotion overcame me. This was the first time I was seized with ecstasy. Romain Rolland says he was destined thus to pass half his life. All human beings experience ecstasy sometime or other. The ecstasy of a mystic is different from that of an ordinary man like me or like us. For us, it does not knock us down to unconscious level. We cannot claim it to be visitation of a superior force like God. For the creative person, it is even a disadvantage since the mind has to work as an observer. He likes to record his feelings. Somewhere, Oscar Wilde cautions creative people against such extremities. To my mind, Ramakrishna was full of love with everything around him, and he was a consummate artist. In this context, I remembered he never allowed Narendra, the young Narendra, to get into Nirvikalpa Samadhi. He told, if you enter that stage, you will enjoy it, and your duty is to propagate certain ideas. And whatever Ramakrishna had meditated and brought out, Vivekananda had to spread the whole world. So that Nirvikalpa Samadhi could have put him in an ecstasy, and if artists also go into that, we will not be painting. And then in his introduction to the catalogue, for Swami Vivekananda's 150th birthday anniversary exhibition, Mr. Arup Ghosh opened our eyes to Swamiji's acquaintance with great art and architecture of his time. Swamiji had an extraordinarily active mind. He predicted what is going to happen to India. Though his attention was more focused on architecture, he could have given us more insight into visual arts had he lived longer. A very important observation he made was that art in India, ancient or medieval, centered on our religion. Another comment is, Bhava is an essential ingredient in Indian aesthetics. Bhava through images. Here I wish to add, this holds good even in abstraction, depending on what you mean by image. Swamiji had such exposure to art collections in National Gallery London, Royal Academy in Burlington Gardens, and also to the work of Rodin in Paris in 1900. Since this is going to be a narrative in creativity in general, the writer's biographical details have to be minimal. Yet, without certain concrete events, it is hard to communicate. This narrative has to be taken against the backdrop of Mr. Arup Ghosh's introductory article for the occasion. And mine is an elliptical narrative because that is how my mind works. There was not much of visual art in my village where I was growing up. We had the temple festivals, the folk dancers visiting our homes. Some of the great percussionists are from our region. That is very important. They played such, I can't say geometry, such patterns and variations for long spells of time on drums. They were beautifully decorated, caparisoned elephant processions. All this presented a lot of colors to the eyes. There were night-long Kathakali performance in summertime. We had a few glass paintings on our walls. Ravi Verma audiographs of gods and goddesses were all over. No one gave any particular attention to all this. There were many rituals in the South Malabar region where I come from, a part of Kerala. The temple festivals were done in elaborate style. Once in a while there would be puja done with great awe to propitiate goddess Kali. Our village people had faith in the goddess and her power to prevent diseases like smallpox and cholera. The vaccines arrived much later. Apart from this, the small deities in family shrines were also worshipped, often for prosperity. Some rituals had the semblance of black magic for winning a village game of dice or a legal battle. There were special pujas. There was even sacrifice of animals or birds, slaughtering them for the blood. The priests danced in trance. To my mind, this was a very primitive practice. My concept of God had no solid foundations yet. When there was a death in the neighborhood, I always wondered what happened to life when death occurs. To this day, I haven't found an answer to it. There was always active literature in Kerala. Some people in my village were very much aware of what was happening in the literary world. Some very renowned writers are from our area, the coastal taluk of Panani and the banks of the river Nila. It was inspiring to see their stories and poems in print. Great books were available in Malayalam. The schools maintained very high standards. Teachers were of solid reputation. Reading out from Shakespeare, Victor Hugo, Tagore. Libraries kept books translated from world literature like Tolstoy, Chekhov, Dostoevsky, Emily Bronte, and Charles Dickens, to name a few. I remember when I was in 8th standard, the teacher was reading out Tagore's Kabuliwala. Towards the end, many were sobbing and wiping tears. The Bengal Renaissance was a great inspiration for the Kerala intellectuals. They are temporarily the same. There is a lot of similarity between the people of Kerala and Bengal, though they are geometrically far apart. They are highly inflammable. There was a little magazine called Samiksha, edited by M. Govindan. This had no regular periodicity. It was not for large circulation. It carried articles on world cinema, literature, and painting. My first exposure to a great work of art of a master like Francisco Goya, that is Colossus, and painting was in that magazine. Till then, I didn't think of that kind of a possibility in art. Goya's fantasy had a great appeal to my mind. In fact, incidentally, I should say the first work I exhibited was a drawing of Swami Vivekananda. I was in fifth form, and there was a school exhibition of science and painting. And then I drew it straight away, looking at the book and copying that, and DEO was visiting the school, it was exhibited. I never collected that work because I was not thinking that I will become a painter. Still, I had no intention of going for painting. I had my literary ambitions, I had a few stories and poems published in periodicals. I was not prolific, my writing suffered from solipsism and morbidity. I nevertheless imagined one day all important magazines will ask for my stories. Through the little magazines, I knew about writers like James Joyce, Marcel Proust, the stream of consciousness method, also about films like Kurosawa's Rashomon, last year in Marianbar, Hiroshima Mon Amour, Padar Panjali. Such little magazines are like meteors, they generate and infuse a new energy and disappear. Therefore, when I accidentally went into painting, I had my literary hangovers. My early paintings were all figurative. A non-figurative art was beyond my grasp. I even argued against such possibilities. It was so natural to go for storytelling and melodramatic themes. Its demands for strong colors fascinated me. The color field became vibrant and charged. At one stage, I was strongly drawn to surrealism. The paintings of this period can broadly be called expressionistic. I should confess it was sort of affected art. Some of the critics had stated that the expressionist school can be case studies of mentally affected people. Its cradle was the war-wounded Germany. So what? The whole creativity stems from such affectations. Born in a village in South Malabar on the river bank, I was exposed to the bright light of sunrise and violent thunderstorms during the onset of monsoon. Our home was near the water. There was such insecurity in our lives. When I was working on my figurative painting, at every stage I was conscious of the literary content and the way color getting sacrificed for the sake of a formal balance in figure. There was something predictable in that kind of picture making process. The object space paradigm was my main concern. One has to push beyond that with no given language to discover a new language, its alphabets, and overall a new syntax. In such pursuit, the old principles of catharsis had no role. My mind stood for pure art, art that is not subversive or storytelling in nature, an art which doesn't need literary props. Already in France, new wave filmmaker Godard was talking against catharsis rudely. Somewhere he says, if they want catharsis, let them go to the toilets. Mind has to lift off from all known parameters and one has to walk through a pathless land. In such shift of sensibility, the biggest tragedy is that you start disliking your own work done till that. You feel like disowning them, knowing full well that at one time you had strong, intimate bond with those works. This happens in every artist's life perhaps, more so if the artist's critical faculties are turned against his own work. Whenever there is a discussion on abstract art in India, the tendency is to bring in the names of two masters, Paul Klee and Kandinsky. They are so dissimilar in their work. Paul Klee was a great visionary. He talks about going for a walk with a line, and Klee definitely had a tremendous impact on the Indian mind. It still continues to haunt the Indian sensibility. Kandinsky could never get over the tendency, as he himself says, of using some elements which are redolent with nature. His experience in color was great. There is a beautiful essay on his outdoor sketching expedition. Often writers say that abstract art in India came into existence through the influence of these two masters. I feel it is not wholly true. Indian mind knows the strength of abstraction. With two distinct systems of classical music, this subcontinent could have gone into abstract art sometime or other. The similarity between music and painting is so powerfully felt in abstraction. The cadence in notes, how a note is held in time, has great similarity to shapes held in tranquil color fields. Several elements contribute to this harmony, which exists on the pictorial space as well as in the artist's inner vision. No accident is ruled out. The creator welcomes accidents and tames them to his advantage. In his essay on spiritual in art, it was discussed many times here, Kandinsky said that every work of art is a child of its time. Often it is the parent of our emotions. He states further, thus every cultural period creates art of its own, which can never be repeated again. Effort to revive art principles of the past at best can only result in art resembling a stillborn child. It is impossible for us to relive or feel the inner spirit of ancient Greeks. Kandinsky adds, we learn the most from music. Music has for centuries been the art which had used this means not so much to represent natural phenomena, but rather as an expression of the artist's spiritual life and to the creation of a unique life of musical sounds. An artist enviously observes the simplicity with which such an aim is achieved in the non-material art of music. The artist must not forget that all mediums contain within themselves unique characteristics, and it is up to him to discover the proper application. We shouldn't be comparing one medium with another. This is important because I always compare painting and literature, and the strong point of literature is not there in art, and the reverse also. Art sometimes achieves what music is incapable of doing. Elsewhere he talks about the Hindus and Madame Blavatsky's Theosophical Society. To my mind, it is significant to observe a world fraternity emerging through art. Humanity grows through such cultural osmosis. When all this is happening at the inner core of your life, quite often we wonder about the mind substance. I mean the material or non-material with which the mind functions. Where does a thought disappear when it is forgotten? Sigmund Freud, before any of us asked this question, and lot of our defenses were broken down. When we talk of Freud, we should think of Patanjali, who knew, and we wrote Chittavritti Nirodham. He was also aware of this, but there was no follow-up in our culture. And we had Carl Gustav Jung after Freud, who is close to our Oriental psyche because he believed in the archetypes and he tried to analyze dreams through another process, not entirely connected to sex symbols. There, Freud has failed somewhere, in my opinion. And Jung used to believe in the occult phenomena. He used to hear explosions in the presence of a girl, and his own mother's table, the walnut table, cracked up for no reason. And when he showed that Freud, he said, no, I don't accept, it doesn't fit into my theories. And in a way it is good, such austerity must be there for science, otherwise witchcraft will crawl into science. Science always